He lived 75 years, saw the world change, but on that night a simple conversation could change everything. For Anthony, every choice carries weight, and a group of young people was about to learn this in the most unexpected way. A life lesson, a decisive moment, and an invitation no one expected. The clock in the central square struck exactly 8 o'clock when Anthony Smith crossed the street with his measured and precise steps. His 75 years weighed on his shoulders like an invisible cloak, but there was something in his gaze that contrasted with the apparent fragility of his figure. He carried a shopping bag from the local market where he had just bought some items for his solitary dinner. The sky of New York City began to darken, painting the buildings with deep blue tones. The city lights blinked lazily, waking up one by one, like artificial stars being born in the concrete. Anthony knew every corner, every shadow of that neighborhood, where he had lived for the last 15 years since he decided to retire, although that word always caused him an ironic smile. His modest apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building was his refuge, a place where he kept not only furniture and objects, but decades of memories that few would believe if they heard. In fact, almost no one knew his true story. To the neighbors, he was just Mr. Anthony, a reserved gentleman who tended to his plants and sometimes helped with small repairs in the building. That night, as he walked down Maple Street, his senses, still extraordinarily sharp, picked up a different movement. A group of young people was talking loudly on the corner, their laughter echoing through the semi-deserted street. In other times, such a scene would have instantly activated his reflexes from decades of training. Now, however, Anthony had learned to channel that energy in a different way. "Good evening, boys," he greeted politely as he passed them. His eyes, for a brief moment, met those of the group's leader, a tall young man of no more than 20 with an air of defiance stamped on his face. Anthony recognized in him something familiar, a misdirected energy that he himself had carried in his youth. "What's up, Gramps?" replied the young man in a tone that mixed mockery and curiosity. "Isn't it a bit late to be out on the street?" Anthony stopped, turning calmly to the group. His movement, though smooth, carried a dignity that made the young men instinctively straighten their posture. "It's never too late to make the right choices, my young friend," he replied with a serene smile that hid decades of experience. The leader of the group, whose name was Mark, felt something different in that gaze. It wasn't fear nor challenge. It was as if that gentleman could see through him, understand his frustrations, his unfulfilled dreams, his anger against a world that seemed to have no place for him. "Do you live around here?" asked another young man from the group, his voice betraying genuine curiosity. "For 15 years, Anthony replied, carefully placing his bag on the ground. "Long enough to see many young people like you choose their paths. Some upwards, others—" He made a significant pause, his eyes scanning each face in the group. "Well, the choices are always ours, aren't they?" Mark stepped forward, and for a moment, it seemed like he was going to say something acidic. But there was something about that gentleman's presence that made him hesitate. It was as if, for the first time in a long time, someone was looking at him not as a threat or a problem, but as a human being with potential. "What do you mean by that?" asked Mark, his voice now lower, almost respectful. Anthony smiled again, picking up his bag. "How about we have a coffee? I have stories to tell that might interest you. Stories about choices, consequences, and second chances." The invitation caught the group by surprise. This was no ordinary gentleman, that much was clear. There was something in his posture, in his gaze, that suggested experiences far beyond what his appearance let on. Mark looked at his friends, who seemed equally intrigued. "There's a coffee shop on the corner that serves excellent coffee," Anthony continued. "And I believe you'll want to hear about the time I had to make a choice that changed not only my life, but the lives of many people." The group looked at each other, curiosity overcoming initial distrust. Mark especially seemed hypnotized by the aura of mystery emanating from this seemingly ordinary gentleman. "All right," Mark decided, to the surprise of his companions. "Let's hear your story." As they walked towards the coffee shop, Anthony smiled inwardly. This night could be the beginning of a significant change in these young people's lives. He knew, better than anyone, how small choices could completely alter a person's destiny. The coffee shop was almost empty at that hour, only a few. Regular customers occupied the formica tables. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and fresh bread created a welcoming atmosphere. Anthony chose a more secluded table where they could talk without being disturbed. "Before I begin," he said, after they had placed their orders, "I need you to understand one thing. The story I'm going to tell is not about violence or power. It's about choices and their consequences. It's about learning to use our strength not to dominate, but to protect and build." The young men adjusted in their chairs, suddenly attentive. There was something in this gentleman's voice that commanded respect, not out of fear, but from a natural authority that came from experience and wisdom. It all started 50 years ago when I was about your age. The coffee smoke rose in lazy spirals as Anthony observed the young faces before him. Mark, the leader of the group, kept his eyes fixed on him, a mixture of curiosity and distrust still present in his countenance. The other four young men, Peter, Luke, Phil and John, settled into their chairs at the coffee shop, their postures oscillating between interest and discomfort. "In 1973, I was an impetuous young man like you," Anthony began, his voice taking on a nostalgic tone. "I grew up on the streets of the Bronx, the son of Irish immigrants who could barely put food on the table. Anger at our situation consumed me, and I was about to make decisions that would change my life forever." The coffee shop bell tinkled as a customer entered, bringing with her a gust of cold wind. Anthony paused, taking a sip of his coffee. His eyes, for a moment, seemed distant, as if traversing decades of memories. "That's when I met Master Chen," he continued, a slight smile appearing on his lips. "An extraordinary man who had recently arrived from Hong Kong. He had a small tea shop in Chinatown, and in his spare time taught traditional martial arts to some selected students." Mark leaned forward, interested. "And how did you meet him?" "In the worst possible way," Anthony laughed softly. "I tried to rob his shop." A surprised silence fell over the table. The young men looked at each other, shocked by the revelation. "What happened?" asked Peter, the youngest of the group, with wide eyes. "He offered me tea," Anthony replied, eliciting nervous laughter. "Yes, you can laugh. There I was, a street kid full of anger, and instead of turning me over to the police, he served me tea and asked why I was so lost." Anthony closed his eyes for a moment, as if he could see the scene unfolding again. "Master Chen taught me that our true strength is not in our ability to hurt others, but in our ability to protect and transform. He trained me not just in body, but mainly in mind and spirit." "And what happened after that?" questioned Mark, his voice betraying genuine interest. "I was recruited," Anthony replied, carefully choosing his words. "A special government agency was looking for young people with specific talents. Master Chen recommended me, and so began my true journey." Phil, who had remained silent until then, frowned. "What kind of agency?" "The kind that officially doesn't exist," Anthony replied with an enigmatic smile. "I spent the following decades serving the country in ways that will never appear in any history book. I traveled the world, learned languages, different cultures, and most importantly, I learned the value of peace." The waiter approached to refill the cups, and Anthony took the moment to observe the impact of his words. He saw in the eyes of those young men the same spark that had once existed in his, the thirst for something greater, the desire for meaning. "But were you like a spy?" John ventured, speaking for the first time. Anthony smiled. "Let's say I was a problem solver. My specialty was avoiding conflicts before they started. Master Chen used to say that the greatest victory is the one that happens without anyone realizing there was a battle." "And why are you telling us all this?" asked Mark, his posture now completely different from his initial arrogance. "Because I see in you what I was," Anthony replied, his tone becoming more serious. "Young people with immense potential, but without direction. The energy you use to intimidate people on the street could be channeled into something much greater." Luke, who had been nervously playing with the napkin, looked up. "Greater like what?" "Like transforming lives," Anthony replied. "Look at Mark, for example. You have natural leadership, son. That could be used to unite people instead of frightening. For them, Peter has a quick mind, John is observant, Phil has empathy hidden under that tough guy mask, and Luke, well, you have an artistic talent that you're trying to hide, don't you? Luke blushed, surprised that Anthony had noticed the small caricatures he was drawing on the napkin. How did you? Mark began, but Anthony gently interrupted him. Observation. Years of training taught me to see beyond appearances, and what I see in you are not potential criminals, but leaders, artists, teachers, people who can make a difference. The silence that followed was profound, laden with reflection. Outside, the night in New York City pulsed with its characteristic energy, indifferent to the small revolution happening inside that coffee shop. And if... Mark hesitated, choosing his words carefully. And if we wanted to learn, to be different? Anthony smiled, his eyes shining with a mixture of satisfaction and hope. Then, my young friend, this would be just the first of many conversations we would have. But first, I need to tell you about a specific mission that changed my life forever. A mission that taught me the true meaning of strength and wisdom. The group moved even closer, completely engrossed in the narrative. The story Anthony was about to tell would be the catalyst for a transformation that none of them could imagine at that moment. The coffee shop clock marked almost 10 o'clock at night, but no one at the table seemed to notice the time passing. The aroma of fresh bread still lingered in the air, now mixing with the smell of rain that was beginning to fall outside. Anthony adjusted himself in the chair, his eyes gaining a different sparkle as he began to tell about the mission that would change his life. It was 1985, and the United States was living a delicate moment of political transition, he began, his voice low and controlled. I was assigned to an apparently simple mission, to protect an American scientist who was developing revolutionary technology in renewable energy. Dr. Robert Miller was his name, a brilliant man who could change the future of the country. Mark and his friends listened attentively, completely forgetting their former challenging postures. The waiter passed again, filling the coffee cups, while Anthony continued his narrative. What made this mission different was that we didn't just need to protect the scientist, but also his 16-year-old daughter, Claire. She had Down syndrome and was the light of Dr. Miller's life. It was through her that I learned my most valuable lesson about strength and protection. Anthony paused, observing how Luke discreetly took another napkin to continue his drawings, now more confident in showing his talent. Claire had a special gift, he continued, smiling at the memory. She could see the best in people, even in those who tried to hurt her. One day, when a group of industrialists tried to pressure Dr. Miller to sell his research, it was Claire's reaction that changed everything. What did she do? Asked Peter, completely absorbed in the story. She offered them cookies, Anthony laughed softly, cookies that she had made herself. Those men, used to getting everything through intimidation, didn't know how to react to the purity and kindness of that girl. It was at that moment that I understood. Sometimes the greatest strength is in not responding to hostility with more hostility. Phil, who until then had maintained a skeptical expression, leaned forward. But how did that solve the problem? I mean, they weren't just going to give up because of some cookies, were they? Not immediately, Anthony replied, but that moment planted a seed. One of the men, Frank Thompson, had a daughter with the same condition as Claire. That encounter made him rethink his actions. He ended up becoming the biggest defender of Dr. Miller's project, transforming a potentially dangerous situation into a productive partnership. And what happened to the technology? Questioned Mark, genuinely interested. It's still in use today, Anthony replied with pride. That research turned into one of the country's largest clean energy projects. And Claire? Well, she became a teacher working with special needs children. I still keep in touch with her. John, who had been quiet for some time, finally spoke. But what about your mission? How did it change you? Anthony smiled, his eyes filling with deep emotion. I realized that I had spent years preparing to face the worst in people, when I should have been preparing to awaken the best in them. Claire taught me that true strength is not in how much you can intimidate someone, but in how much you can inspire positive changes. The rain outside was getting stronger, creating a curtain of water that blurred the coffee shop windows. Mark looked at his own hands, as if seeing them differently for the first time. After that mission, Anthony continued, I began to change my approach. I started looking for solutions that would unite people instead of creating more divisions. And you know what I discovered? That this is the true art of protection, building bridges instead of walls. Is that why you're talking to us today? Asked Luke, raising his eyes from his drawing, which now showed an impressive sketch of Anthony himself. Exactly, Anthony confirmed, because I see in you the same potential that Claire saw in those men, the capacity for change, to make a positive difference in the world. You have strength, you have leadership, you have talents. The question is, how will you use them? The silence that followed was profound, each young man lost in his own thoughts. The story of Claire and her transformative influence seemed to have touched something within them, especially in Mark, who now had a thoughtful expression that completely replaced his former tough guy mask. Do you, Mark began, hesitant, really think we can be different, do something worthwhile? Anthony leaned forward, his eyes meeting those of each of the young men. I don't just think so, I'm certain of it. And if you're willing, I can show you how. But first, I need to tell you about another important encounter I had years later with someone who was exactly where you are now. The rain continued its constant drumming against the windows, but inside the coffee shop something was changing. A silent transformation was beginning to happen in those young men, just as it had happened to Anthony so many years ago. The night was advancing, and the coffee shop was almost empty. The owner, Mr. Manuel, occasionally glanced at the table where Anthony and the young men were talking, but something in the elderly man's serene presence reassured him. The rain had diminished to a fine drizzle, creating a soft musical background for the next story. In 1992, Anthony began, I met a young man named Richard Santos. He was very much like you, Mark. Same age, same defiant look, same natural leadership being used in the wrong way. Mark adjusted himself in the chair, clearly interested in the comparison. The other young men also moved closer, sensing that this story would be especially significant. Richard was the son of an important businessman in New York, Anthony continued. He had everything money could buy but carried an immense emptiness. His father, always busy with business, barely noticed his existence. His mother was always traveling, immersed in social events. Richard grew up with anger, a lot of anger. Luke stopped drawing, his pencil suspended in the air. Peter and Phil exchanged significant looks while John kept his eyes fixed on Anthony. At the time, I was officially retired from the agency, but I still maintained contacts. That's when I received a desperate phone call from Richard's father. His son had started getting involved with dangerous people, using his intelligence and charisma to lead a group that was practicing increasingly serious acts. How did you approach him? Asked Mark, his voice betraying a personal interest in the story. The same way I'm approaching you now, Anthony smiled, by offering an attentive ear and a different perspective. I met Richard in a diner very similar to this one, on a rainy night like today. Anthony paused to take a sip of coffee, his eyes lost in memories. The first thing I did was ask him about his dreams, not about his problems, his revolts, or his actions. I asked what he wanted to be when he was a child before all the anger took over. And what did he answer? Questioned Peter, completely involved in the narrative. A doctor, Anthony replied with a soft smile. He had wanted to be a doctor since he was 6 years old, when his grandmother fell ill, and he promised that one day he would cure her of... Of course, his grandmother had long since passed, but that dream was still there, buried under layers of hurt and frustration. The group remained silent, each processing their own connections to the story. Luke had started a new drawing, this time portraying a young man with a lost expression, surprisingly similar to Richard's description. I spent the next few months working with Richard, Anthony continued. It wasn't easy. There were moments of resistance, relapse, doubt, but gradually we began to rebuild that forgotten dream. I used my contacts to get him to do volunteer work at a public hospital. The experience of seeing up close the suffering and overcoming of people changed something inside him. And did he make it? Did he become a doctor? Asked John, breaking his usual silence. Anthony smiled, reaching for his wallet. From it, he pulled out an old photo and placed it on the table. The image showed a man in a white coat, smiling next to Anthony in front of a hospital. Dr. Richard Santos is now one of the leading cardiac surgeons at the City Hospital, specialized in pediatric surgeries. He not only realized his dream, but transformed it into something even greater. Every child he saves is a way of honoring his grandmother's memory. Mark carefully picked up the photo, studying the smiling faces. And his father. That's another interesting part of the story, Anthony replied. Seeing his son's transformation made Mr. Santos change as well. Today they run a foundation together that offers free medical treatment for underprivileged children. Richard's anger turned into purpose, and his leadership power, once used to destroy, now builds futures. Anthony observed how his words reverberated in each of the young men. He saw in their eyes the same spark of recognition he had seen in Richard so many years ago, the realization that their lives could be different. "Do you know why I'm telling you this story?" Anthony asked, his gaze fixing especially on Mark. "Because you think we can change too," Mark replied, his voice softer than usual. "No," Anthony gently corrected, "because I know you can change. Like Richard, each of you carries a forgotten dream, an untapped talent, an unfulfilled purpose. The question is, are you willing to rediscover it?" The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It was no longer a silence of tension or distrust, but of deep reflection. Outside, the drizzle had stopped, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the night sky of New York City. "And what if," Mark began, hesitant, "what if we don't know where to start?" Anthony's smile widened. "That's why I'm here. Because sometimes all we need is someone who sees in us what we can no longer see ourselves. And I have an even more surprising story to tell about how small choices can trigger extraordinary transformations." Mr. Manuel had already begun to arrange the empty chairs in the bakery, but he kept the light on and cast understanding glances at the table where Anthony and the young men were talking. There was something different in the air, a transformative energy that seemed almost palpable. "The story I'm going to tell now," Anthony began, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "happened in 2001 and involves not one but 5 different lives. Interestingly, it was a group very similar to you." Luke, who now had several drawings spread out on the table, raised his eyes with renewed interest. Mark, who was still holding Dr. Richard's photo, gently returned it to Anthony. "I was teaching self-defense classes at a community project in the Bronx," Anthony continued. "One day, 5 teenagers broke into the place, thinking they would take the equipment. What they didn't expect was to find 30 children in the middle of a judo class." "What happened?" asked Phil, leaning forward. "One of the children, a 10-year-old girl named Mary, approached their leader and said something that would change everything. You can learn too if you want." The simplicity of that offer, the total absence of fear or judgment, caught everyone by surprise. Anthony paused, observing how the young men reacted to the story. He saw in their faces the same astonishment he had witnessed that day. The leader, Michael, was 17 at the year time. Like you, he had potential wasted on destructive actions. But at that moment something changed. Maybe it was Mary's innocence, or maybe the sight of children training with discipline and respect. He lowered what he had in his hands and asked, "How much does it cost?" "And you let them in?" questioned John, his voice betraying disbelief. "Better than that," Anthony smiled. "I offered them a proposal. They could train for free, but they would have to help teach the younger children. It was an exchange. While learning the martial art, they would also learn about responsibility, discipline, and mentoring." "And did they accept?" asked Peter, completely absorbed in the story. "Not immediately," Anthony replied. "Michael was the first. He started showing up alone, always at the end of classes, observing from afar. After a week, he brought his first friend. In a month, all 5 were there." Anthony took out another photo from his wallet. This one showed a group of young people wearing judo uniforms, surrounded by smiling children. "This photo is from 6 months later. Michael is here." He pointed to a tall young man in the center of the image. He discovered he had a natural gift for teaching. The children adored him, and he began to change. He was no longer the leader of a gang, but a mentor, an example. Mark picked up the photo, studying it carefully. What happened to them afterwards? Michael graduated in physical education, Anthony replied with evident pride. Today, he manages 3 community projects in different neighborhoods. Carlos, the friend he brought first, is a physiotherapist. George became a history teacher. Robert is a social worker. And Anna is a psychologist. They all work with at-risk youth. How did they manage? Asked Mark, his voice betraying a mixture of hope and skepticism. I mean, it couldn't have been easy. It wasn't, Anthony agreed. There were obstacles, doubts, moments of near giving up. But the key was that they had discovered something more valuable than any material gain, a purpose. And when you find your purpose, you also find the strength to overcome obstacles. Luke had started a new drawing, this time portraying the group from the photo in quick but precise strokes. Anthony observed the work with approval. You know, Luke, Michael used to draw too. He used his drawings to teach children about movements and positions. He transformed his talent into a teaching tool. Luke blushed slightly but didn't stop drawing. For the first time, he seemed proud of his gift, instead of trying to hide it. The most incredible thing about this story, Anthony continued, is how a single choice, Michael's decision to put down his weapons and accept a child's offer, created a chain reaction that affected hundreds of lives. Every young person they help today is a new transformation story beginning. Do you still have contact with them? Asked Phil. I do, Anthony smiled. In fact, I'm visiting Michael's project this weekend. He always says that night at the gym was the moment his life really began. And you know what's most interesting? He often receives young people very similar to what he was, referred by the justice system or brought by social workers. Anthony made a significant pause, his eyes scanning each face in front of him. A person's true strength is not in how many they can dominate, but in how many they can elevate. Michael and his friends learned this, and today they are living proof that it's never too late to change the course of your story. The silence that followed was laden with reflection. Each young man seemed lost in his own thoughts, processing the implications of the story they had just heard. Outside, the New York night continued its course, but inside that bakery something profound was changing. Mr. Anthony, Mark finally said, his voice softer than usual, do you think we could meet Michael? Anthony's smile widened. I thought you'd never ask, but before that I have one more story to tell. One that will help you understand why I'm so certain that you can change your lives. Mr. Manuel approached the table with a tray of fresh bread. On the house, he said with a gentle smile, some conversations deserve to be accompanied by warm bread. Anthony thanked him with a nod, recognizing in the baker the same ability to perceive significant moments that he himself had developed over the years. The story I'm going to tell now, Anthony began after Mr. Manuel had walked away, is about someone you already know. It's about Master Chen, the man who changed my life so many years ago. The young men adjusted in their chairs, feeling they were about to hear something especially important. Luke picked up a new napkin, preparing for another drawing. In 2010, I received a call from the hospital, Anthony continued, his voice soft but firm. Master Chen was admitted, advanced age, heart problems. When I got there, I found his grandson, Lee, sitting in the hallway. He was 16 and had the same anger-filled eyes that I had when I met his grandfather. Mark exchanged a significant look with his friends. The story was beginning to touch on something familiar to all of them. Lee was angry, Anthony went on. Not just about his grandfather's situation, but about his whole life. Child of separated parents, problems at school, involvement with the wrong people. Master Chen, who had always been his safe harbor, was now fragile, and Lee didn't know how to deal with it. What did you do? Asked Peter, his voice almost a whisper. I did what Master Chen had done with me decades earlier. I offered tea, Anthony smiled. I took Lee to his grandfather's old tea shop, which was still operating in the same place. While preparing the drink, exactly as his grandfather had taught me, I began to tell stories. About a rebellious young man who tried to rob that same shop, about a girl with Down syndrome who changed hearts with cookies, about a future doctor lost in his anger, about 5 young people who transformed their lives through martial arts. Luke had stopped drawing, his pencil suspended in the air, completely absorbed in the narrative. John, who usually maintained physical distance, had leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. Lee listened to everything in silence, Anthony continued. And then he asked the same question you asked earlier, Mark. How do I start to change? And what did you answer? Asked Mark, his voice betraying barely contained anxiety. I told him what I'm telling you now. It starts with a choice. Thy single choice to do something different today than you did yesterday. For Lee, that choice was to take over the management of his grandfather's tea shop. He began to study about teas, about Eastern culture, about traditional medicine. He transformed the shop into a cultural center, where today young people learn not only about teas but about history, respect and tradition. Anthony paused, taking a sip of his now cold coffee. The most interesting thing is that the shop became a meeting point for people seeking change. Lee developed a special program where at-risk youth can learn the tea, trade, study and receive mentoring. Many of them are referred by Michael's project, creating a circle of transformation that keeps growing. Phil, who had been quiet for a while, finally spoke. Master Chen, did he see this change? Anthony's smile softened. Yes, he had that privilege. He lived long enough to see his grandson not only transform, but become an agent of transformation for others. When he passed, it was with the certainty that his legacy would continue to live through Lee, just as it continues to live through me and all those who were touched by his wisdom. And does the shop still exist? Asked John. It does, Anthony replied. In fact, it's just a few blocks from here. Lee kept everything as it was, just expanded the space and modernized a few things. The same aroma of teas, the same wooden furniture, the same atmosphere of peace that welcomed me so many years ago. Luke had resumed drawing, this time portraying a traditional Eastern tea shop with surprisingly precise details for someone who had never seen it. You know what's most incredible, Anthony continued, observing the drawing take shape, how all these stories connect. Claire, Dr. Miller's daughter, sometimes gives lectures at the shop about inclusion. Dr. Richard offers free consultations for the young people in Michael's project. Lee supplies teas to the hospital where Richard works. It's as if each act of transformation creates waves that continue to expand, touching more and more lives. It's like a network, Mark murmured, more to himself than to the others. Exactly, Anthony agreed. A network of people who chose to use their strength to elevate others instead of bringing them down. And this network is always open to new members. The silence that followed was different from all the previous ones. It was no longer a silence of distrust or reflection, but of possibility, of hope. Mr. Anthony, Mark finally said, do you think we could visit Lee's shop, see this place? Anthony's smile widened. Actually, I have something even better in mind. But before that, I need to tell one last story, one that will tie everything we've talked about together and show you why this meeting today was not by chance. The night was already late, and Mr. Manuel had begun to turn off some of the bakery lights, leaving only the corner where they were, illuminated. The aroma of coffee and bread had been replaced by the characteristic smell of end of business, a mixture of cleaning products and the promise of a new day. You must be wondering why, of all nights, I chose this one to be here. Anthony began, his eyes shining with ancient wisdom. The truth is, I didn't choose, I was called. The young men looked at each other, confused. Mark frowned, trying to understand. Called? By whom? He asked. By Mr. Manuel, Anthony replied, gesturing towards the baker who was pretending to be busy cleaning the counter. He's been calling me every night this week, worried about a group of young people who started frequenting the area. Young people with potential, he said, but who were starting to intimidate customers. The revelation fell like a silent bomb on the table. Luke stopped drawing, his pencil frozen in the air. Peter and Phil exchanged embarrassed looks while John lowered his eyes to his hands. But how do you know Mr. Manuel? Asked Mark, his voice betraying a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Anthony smiled, pulling out another photo from his wallet. It was an old image, yellowed by time, showing a group of young men in front of a newly opened bakery. Because 40 years ago I was in his place. This bakery, Anthony made a sweeping gesture, was my first mission after leaving active service. Master Chen convinced me to invest my savings in something that could serve the community. The idea was to create a meeting point, a safe place where people could connect, talk, transform their lives. "Wait," interrupted Phil. "You were the owner of this bakery." "For 15 years, Anthony confirmed. "It was here that I met Manuel, a young Portuguese man newly arrived in America, full of dreams but without direction. He started washing dishes and, over time, became my right-hand man. When I decided to retire for good, I had no doubts. The bakery should be his." Mr. Manuel, who had silently approached, placed his hand on Anthony's shoulder. His eyes were misty. "And it was the best decision anyone ever made for me," said Manuel, speaking for the first time since the night began, "because Anthony didn't just sell me a bakery, he taught me a purpose." Manuel continued the tradition, Anthony went on. "This bakery was never just a business. It's a safe harbor, a place where people can find not only bread but also welcome and opportunities for change." Luke had resumed drawing, now portraying the bakery in different eras, creating a visual timeline on the margin of the napkin. "Over the years," Anthony continued, "many transformation stories began here. It was at that table," he pointed to a corner, "that I met Richard. It was there," he indicated the counter, "that Lee served his first tea outside his grandfather's shop. And it was exactly where you're sitting that Michael and his group decided to change their lives." Mark looked at the chair he was sitting on, as if it had suddenly gained sacred significance. "There are no coincidences," Anthony said softly. "When Manuel called me talking about you, I knew it was time for another transformation story to begin, because you're not so different from Richard, from Michael, from Lee, or even from me when I was young. You're just people looking for your place in the world, using your strength the wrong way because no one has shown you a better path yet." "And you want to show us that path?" asked Mark, his voice barely containing the emotion. "No," Anthony replied, surprising everyone. "I want you to discover your own path. But I'm willing to be a guide, just as Master Chen was for me, just as I was for Manuel, for Richard, for Michael, and for so many others." "And where do we start?" asked John, speaking with a determination that surprised even himself. "With a choice," Anthony replied. "The same choice that each person in these stories had to make. The decision to be more than what circumstances tried to make of you." Mr. Manuel returned to the table bringing a tray with steaming cups, but it wasn't coffee. "Tea?" asked Peter, recognizing the characteristic aroma. "From Lee's shop," Manuel confirmed with a smile. "He always keeps some special blends here. For moments like this." "Moments like this?" questioned Phil. "Moments of transformation," Anthony replied, picking up his cup. "Because every great change begins with a moment like this. People gathered, sharing stories and choices. The aroma of tea filled the air, mixing with the promise of new beginnings." Outside, the New York night continued its course, indifferent to the small miracle happening inside that coffee shop. But within those walls, 5 young men were about to discover that their lives were about to change forever. "So," said Anthony, after everyone had picked up their cups, "who wants to be the first to share their forgotten dream?" The silence that followed Anthony's question was dense with possibilities. The aroma of Lee's special tea lingered in the air, creating an almost mystical atmosphere in the now empty coffee shop. Luke, surprising everyone, was the first to speak. "I always wanted to be an artist," he said, his voice low but firm, as he held the napkin full of drawings. "Since I was little, it was my way of escaping. When things got tough at home, I would draw other worlds, other realities." Anthony nodded encouragingly, observing how the other young men looked at Luke with a mixture of surprise and respect. "My father," Luke continued, his voice trembling slightly, "he said that art doesn't fill your stomach, that I needed to be a real man. So I started hiding my drawings, pretending I wasn't who I was. "May I see your drawings?" Anthony asked gently. Luke passed the napkins with hesitation. "This isn't just talent," said Anthony, studying the lines carefully. "This is a gift. You don't just draw what you see, but what you feel. Look how you captured the essence of each story I told today." Mr. Manuel, who was observing closely, commented, You know, Luke, this coffee shop needs a new visual identity. Posters, menus, even murals on the walls. Luke's eyes widened with the possibility implicit in those words. My turn, said Peter, inspired by Luke's courage. I always wanted to work with children. I haven't told anyone, but I do volunteer work secretly at a social project near my home. Only on weekends when I say I'm going to play ball. Mark looked at Peter in amazement. Is that why you always refuse invitations on Saturdays? Peter nodded, blushing slightly. The children there, they make me feel useful. You know, like I could really make a difference. You already do, Anthony affirmed. And I'm sure Michael would love to meet you. His social project always needs committed young people. John, who was usually the quietest, surprisingly spoke next. I like computers, he said, almost in a whisper. I learned by myself, tinkering. With old machines, I found. I always dreamed of creating programs that could help people, but, Anthony encouraged, who would trust a kid from the hood to mess with technology? John completed, the bitterness evident in his voice. Doctor, Richard is actually looking for someone to develop software for his free medical care project, Anthony commented casually. Someone who understands both technology and the reality of underprivileged communities. John's eyes shone with long dormant hope. Phil was playing with his teacup, clearly nervous. I write, he finally revealed. Poetry, actually. I started after my mom, after she passed. It was my way of dealing with feelings. Luke immediately pushed a clean napkin in his direction. Phil hesitated for a moment, then began to write. When he finished, he read in a low voice a poem about forgotten dreams and reborn hopes that left everyone in silence for a few moments. Lee's shop, Anthony said softly, has poetry readings every Thursday. It's a space where people share not just words but pieces of their souls. Finally, all eyes turned to Mark. The leader of the group, always so confident and tough, seemed vulnerable for the first time. I don't even know anymore, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. I spent so much time trying to be what others expected, trying to be strong in the wrong way, that I forgot who I wanted to be. Sometimes, Anthony replied, not knowing is the first step to discovering. You have natural leadership, Mark. That's a gift. The question is, what kind of leader do you want to be? Mark was silent for a long moment, looking at his friends as if seeing them for the first time. He saw Luke, the sensitive artist, Peter, the born educator, John, the technology genius, Phil, the poet from the hood, each of them harboring talents and dreams that he, as a leader, should have noticed and encouraged. I want to be the kind of leader who helps others find their way, he said finally. Like you did with us today. Anthony smiled, a smile full of understanding and hope. You know what all the people in the stories I told today have in common? They not only transformed their own lives, but became bridges for others to do the same. Mr. Manuel, who had been discreetly in the background, approached the table again. This coffee shop has always been more than a business, he said. It's a meeting point for dreams, and there's always room for a few more dreamers. What happens now? Asked Mark, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility for his friends. Anthony took a last sip of his tea before answering. Now, my young friends, begins the most difficult and rewarding part of the journey, turning these dreams into reality, and I have a proposal to make to you. The coffee shop clock marked almost midnight, but no one seemed to notice the late hour. The anticipation for Anthony's proposal kept everyone alert, their faces illuminated by a mixture of anxiety and hope. My proposal is simple, Anthony began, resting his hands on the table, but it will require total commitment from each of you. What I offer is not just a chance for change, but a complete transformation program. Mr. Manuel brought a last round of tea, while Anthony continued. For 3 months, each of you will have a specific learning opportunity aligned with your talents and dreams, but there's a condition. You'll need to work together, supporting each other on this journey. How would this work? Asked Mark, leaning forward with interest. Luke, Anthony turned to the young artist, In addition to creating the new visual identity for the coffee shop, as Manuel suggested, you will have the opportunity to participate in an art education program in Michael's project. Your skills can inspire other children to find their own voice through art. Luke's eyes sparkled with the possibility. Peter, you'll work directly with Michael, learning how to transform your love for teaching into a real career. His project needs someone with your heart and dedication. Peter nodded, too emotional to speak. John, I'll introduce you to Dr. Richard next week. In addition to the software for the social project, he needs someone to teach basic computer skills to young people in the community. You'll be able to develop your technical skills while helping others grow. John smiled for the first time that night, a shy but hopeful smile. Phil, Anthony continued, in addition to the poetry readings at Lee's shop, there's a creative writing workshop project for young people in recovery at the hospital where Richard works. Your poetry can be a powerful healing tool for others. Phil clutched the napkin with his poem as if holding a precious treasure. And you, Mark, Anthony made a significant pause, will have the most important challenge. You'll be the link that keeps everyone united. While each one develops their individual talent, you'll learn from me and Lee the arts of positive leadership and mentoring. But how are we going to do all this? Asked Mark, the responsibility weighing in his voice. We have our families. We need to earn money. That's why I called this a program, Anthony smiled. Each activity includes a modest scholarship provided by Dr. Richard's foundation. It's not much, but it's enough for you to dedicate yourselves to this transformation process. Mr. Manuel, who had remained silent, added, and the coffee shop always needs help on weekends. I can offer part-time work to supplement your income. But there's more, Anthony continued. Each person I mentioned in my stories, Richard, Michael, Lee, Claire, agreed to be a mentor to one of you. You'll have guidance, support, and, most importantly, living examples that change is possible. And on weekends, he added, we'll meet here at this same table to share progress, challenges, and keep each other on the right path. This coffee shop will be our meeting point, our safe harbor. Luke had already begun to sketch a new drawing, this time showing the 5 friends in different scenarios, teaching children, working with computers, reciting poetry, all connected by a line leading back to the coffee shop. But we need to start immediately, Anthony said seriously. Tomorrow itself, if you accept, because transformation is like a plant. The sooner we plant, the sooner we reap the fruits. And if we fail, asked John, his voice betraying insecurity. There is no failure in this process, Anthony replied gently. Only learning. Every person I mentioned today faced challenges, had moments of doubt, wanted to give up. But you know what kept them on track? The support of each other, the network of people who believed in them. Like a family, Phil murmured. Exactly. Like a family, Anthony confirmed. A chosen family, united not by blood but by purpose. Mark looked at each of his friends, seeing in their faces the same mix of fear and hope that he felt. Do we need time to think? He asked. Actually, Anthony replied, slowly standing up, I need your answer now, because tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, Lee will be opening his shop for a special tea ceremony. Michael will be there with some of his students. Richard will come before his hospital shift. Claire will bring some of her students for a special presentation. Everyone will be there waiting to meet you. The silence that followed was profound, laden with meaning. Each young man processed the weight of that decision, the magnitude of the opportunity that presented itself. So, said Anthony, his voice gentle but firm, who's ready to start their transformation story? The coffee shop bell rang softly with the night breeze that entered through the half-open door. Outside, New York City was beginning to fall asleep, but inside that establishment, 5 young men were more awake than ever, facing the most important moment of their lives so far. Mark was the first to stand up. His movement was decisive, without hesitation, surprising even himself with the clarity of his decision. I accept, he said, his voice firm, not just for myself but for all of us, because for the first time I feel like I can be the kind of leader who makes a positive difference in people's lives. Luke stood up next, his drawings spread across the table telling the story of that extraordinary night. "I accept too," he declared, his voice more confident than it had ever been. "I want to use my art to show others that there are different paths." "I accept," said Peter, standing up with misty eyes. "Those children in the project, they deserve someone who believes in them like you believed in us today." John, the quietest of the group, rose slowly. "I accept," he murmured, then cleared his throat and repeated louder. "I accept. I want to create technology that brings people together instead of pushing them apart." Phil was the last to stand, holding his poem like a talisman. "I accept," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Because every story deserves to be told, every voice deserves to be heard." Anthony observed the scene with a serene smile, recognizing in that moment the same transformative power that had changed his own life so many years ago. Mr. Manuel, discreetly wiping his eyes with a napkin, began to turn on the coffee shop. Lights he had previously turned off. "Then it's decided," said Anthony, standing up as well. "Tomorrow at 9 o'clock your journey begins. But in truth it has already begun here tonight with this choice." Luke took one last napkin and began to draw quickly. In a few minutes a portrait of the group emerged, not as they were but as they could be. Mark as a respected mentor, Peter teaching children, John developing technological projects, Phil sharing his poetry, and himself creating art that inspired others. "May I keep this?" Anthony asked, looking at the drawing. "It will be perfect next to the other transformation memories I collect." Mr. Manuel approached with a tray. "One last tea before we go. This is special. A blend that Lee prepares only for occasions of new beginnings." As the aroma of tea filled the environment for the last time that night, Anthony looked at each of the young men with special attention. "Know that none of this will be easy," he said seriously. "There will be days of doubt, moments of wanting to give up. But remember this night. Remember all the stories I shared. Claire and her cookies that melted hardened hearts. Richard and his journey from rebellion to healing. Michael and his group, who transformed strength into protection. Lee and his rediscovery of family legacy. And now our story," Mark completed, finally understanding. "Yes," Anthony smiled. "Your story is just beginning, and like all the others I told today, it will also serve as inspiration for others in the future." Mr. Manuel approached with a set of keys. "The coffee shop opens at 6 a.m., he said with a warm smile. "Anyone who wants to start training early tomorrow is welcome." The young men looked at each other, smiling at the implicit offer of trust. Luke was already imagining the murals he could create on the walls. John was thinking about a digital ordering system he could develop. Phil visualized poetry sessions on Sunday afternoons. Peter considered special programs for children. And Mark saw all of this connecting into something bigger. "Before we go," said Anthony, "I want you to know something. Today you not only chose to change your lives, but you became part of something bigger, a transformation network that began many years ago and will continue long after us. Every person you help, every life you touch will be a new link in this chain." The group gathered for one last moment together on that historic night. Outside, the first signs of dawn were beginning to appear, promising a new day, a new beginning. "Tomorrow at 9 a.m. at Lee's shop," confirmed Mark, naturally assuming his role as a positive leader. "Tomorrow," Anthony agreed, "the rest of your lives begin." As the young men left the coffee shop, transformed by the experience of that extraordinary night, Anthony remained for a moment with Mr. Manuel, watching them through the window. "You know, Manuel," he said with a satisfied smile, "I think we've just witnessed the beginning of another incredible story." "Like ours," Manuel replied, beginning to organize the tables for the new day that was about to begin. "Like ours," Anthony agreed, knowing that somewhere Master Chen would be smiling, proud to see his legacy of transformation continuing through new generations. The night was coming to an end in New York City, but for 5 young men it was just the beginning of an extraordinary journey. A journey that would prove once again that it's never too late to choose a new path, that true strength lies in lifting others up, and that the most powerful stories are those that inspire transformation. Dear readers, we hope that the transformation journey of Mark, Luke, Peter, John, and Phil has touched your hearts. To continue following equally inspiring stories, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and leave your like. The transformation of each of these young men reminds us that there is always hope and that it's never too late to start over. Share your own transformation stories in the comments and tell us which city you're watching from. Together we can create an even larger network of stories that inspire positive changes.